Who walks away from a 7-figure career and the prestige of being a Harvard-trained anesthesiologist, from what many would consider the pinnacle of medical achievement? I'm going to walk you through my journey and thought process, not because I think everyone should quit medicine, but because understanding why I made this decision might help you think differently about your own path, whether that's in medicine or not. Frankly, I had always loved learning. In undergrad, I loved chemistry because I loved seeing why. And specifically, I loved seeing not only why things happened, but also to be able to use science and to be able to use what it is that I learned to explain what happened in everyday life. I was a chemistry major because I loved to use science to explain simple things like how does soap work or how does a nonstick pan work. You could use the chemical structure to help you see exactly why they work the way that they do. In many ways, medicine was the next logical step in the sequence. At its best, medicine takes scientific principles that you can use to not only explain and understand real-world phenomena, but you can also apply them to help people in some of the deepest and darkest moments of their life. In addition to this, I always loved teaching. And to me, the best medicine is really, at core, just good teaching. You're meeting patients where they are and explaining what's happening to them and creating a path forward together. Einstein said once that the peak of genius is simplicity. Ultimately, what I think the best doctors are doing is they're taking really complex things and they're distilling it down to simple but powerful ideas that patients can use to make meaningful decisions about their health. My choice to enter medicine wasn't just about knowing facts. Instead, it was about using that knowledge to make a real difference in people's lives. As often happens with the idealistic, I think that I was hit pretty hard with reality in some ways. I should have had a clue at my first day at Stanford during the day of our white coat ceremony when our families come and you get your white coat. Abraham Verghese, who was one of the most famous doctors at Stanford, gave our welcome address, and it was not at all what I was expecting. One of the things I remember most clearly was that he got in front of the entire class. He basically told us about the disillusionment that happens throughout the course of most people's medical training. He specifically said that there are the pre-cynical years and the cynical years, as opposed to the preclinical and the clinical years. He was describing how the system of medicine and the way that it is practiced can oftentimes lead people down a very dark path. Granted, this was somewhat of a downer of a way to start, although I will say that my experience at Stanford was overall excellent. It's rare to have the privilege of being around so many brilliant, hardworking people and to be able to learn not just from what it is that they're teaching you directly, but also to be able to observe them up close and to see what makes these really successful people tick. And I think that that's one of the most valuable things that I took away from that experience. Despite how many excellent, amazing, inspiring individuals there were, in my first year, there were the seeds of what would ultimately become my decision to leave medicine. It started with me realizing that the system of education made learning far more difficult than it needed to be. They estimate that medical knowledge doubles roughly every couple months. What that means practically is that what you need to know now as a doctor is much more than you needed to know even 10 or 15 years ago. Even when I was a first-year medical student, it was clear that the system wasn't built to support this challenge. The problem that I saw in education wasn't just true of Stanford, it was a universal medical education problem, at least as far as I can tell. The reason for this problem is that there's deeply misaligned incentives for the people actually teaching medicine. So what do I mean? The problem with medical education is that the system doesn't incentivize good teaching. In fact, I would argue that the system incentivizes people to teach as poorly as possible. And let me explain what I mean. For most people that teach medical school classes, they're not actually trained or selected based on their teaching. Most people in universities like Stanford or other places are chosen because they're excellent researchers or they're excellent clinicians or both. It is extremely rare that someone is hired for their teaching ability, and it's even more rare that someone is incentivized via pay or promotions based on their teaching. It's kind of like in high school where there are some assignments that are going to count for your grade, and then there are other assignments that don't count for your grade. For the assignments that don't count for your grade, people tend to spend very minimal time on that because by spending more time on that, they're taking away time from the things that are actually going to matter for their grade at the end of the year. In the same way that I wouldn't blame a high schooler for not focusing on something that's not going to count at all for their grade, I don't think we should fault a teacher who's spending pretty minimal time working on their lessons if those lessons aren't really going to further their personal or their professional aims. Instead, I think that we should celebrate the people that are working against their economic incentives in order to really try their best to teach well, because really those are the people that should be celebrated, and there's tons of them in the system. If this was the only problem, I don't think I would have gotten as disillusioned with education as I did. Instead, I think the biggest problem that we have is the diffusion of responsibility, where that instead of having one teacher teach an entire system, like one person teaches all of cardiology or most most of it. Instead, we might have 3 different teachers teaching 3 different lessons per day and not having those same teachers come back, but instead having new teachers come in every time. Again, I don't think it's a problem with the people or a problem with their desire of actually doing a good job. It's just a mismatch of expectations and a gross mismatch of how it is that we're structuring the learning of relative beginners. The next thing I'm going to talk about is how I thrived despite the system, not because of it. Someone said once that to be exceptional, you have to be the exception. And I think that the way that the medical education system was set up, I think it actually rewarded those who were willing and able to think differently. Because so many lectures were based around sort of memorization of facts and regurgitation of information, since again, from a teacher standpoint, that's the easiest thing to teach and the easiest way to test the information, it created a huge advantage for me because I really wanted to understand it. I genuinely enjoyed learning. And so understanding how things fit together made a dramatic difference. I also think the fact that I had been a teacher for years beforehand also helped me to understand how to ask the right questions and how to get the most out of my lectures. I wanted to not only remember, but also understand the information forever, not just because I wanted to regurgitate it on an exam. Around this time, I also discovered the power of spaced repetition. I could use Anki cards to reinforce all of the things that I was learning, not to memorize it like most people I think are using spaced repetition for, but actually to understand it at a deep level and to use those cards to make sure that I never forgot the deep connections that I was making. The result was that I scored 270, which was at the time the top 0.1% on step 1. It's ironic, but I think that I stood out in part because the system incentivizes bad teaching and it rewards people who really love learning. The next part I'll talk about is why I chose anesthesiology, which also plays a role in why it is that I think I ultimately chose to leave medicine. In anesthesia, most people think about it as like you're just putting people to sleep. Not only is that not technically true in the sense that anesthesia does not at all reflect true restorative sleep, also I don't think it's true in that it doesn't reflect the true depth of understanding that anesthesiologists need to have of the body. In anesthesia, what you're doing is you're shutting down the nervous system, both the conscious as well as the unconscious. In particular, you have to understand the body's automatic system so well that when those start to shut down, you can step in and take over. What the body would normally do on autopilot, whether it's constricting the blood vessels or moving their head or their feet because it's going to be losing blood over time, you become the body's autopilot. I was blessed to match at Harvard MGH, which in my opinion was the top anesthesiology program for what it is that I was looking for. Everyone from the nurses to the techs to the respiratory therapists, everyone was operating at the highest level that I think I'd ever seen. It was truly a culture of excellence that reinforced my approach and belief in deliberate practice of always trying to find ways of bettering myself in little bits where I would go in and I would think like, what am I going to get better at today? What is the one thing that I want to work on this week that can make me a better physician? And to be in a situation where there's world-class surgeons and clinicians that you're working with, you're constantly being challenged, I think was a remarkable experience. If that had been my only experience, I think that I would still be an anesthesiologist today. But what happened was something that was serendipitous. As I mentioned earlier, one of the things I've always loved to do was to teach. I'd always had as my goal to be a dean of a medical school somewhere. I was inspired to talk to some of the deans at Stanford Medical School when I was a student there, and it was clear to me that they were brilliant educators. One of the things that I realized when I spoke with them, though, was that even though they were brilliant educators, they were still constrained by the system. I remember that there was a lecture by one of the top dogs in education at Stanford, and I remember thinking it was brilliant, but also that it didn't really matter how good the dean was if there were 80 different lecturers who couldn't coordinate their lectures and didn't have the proper training or incentives to actually produce excellent educational outcomes. In other words, I started to feel like many of the deans that I spoke with were trying to herd cats. Like they had these brilliant ideas of how it is that they could change education. Because of the way that the system was set up, it was a losing battle. In part because I love teaching, and in part because I graduated pretty early, my final year of medical school, I had started a blog about my ideas of how people should learn, and essentially how I had learned how to succeed despite the system, not because of it. To my surprise, during residency, even though I was working very part-time, it really started to take off. People were approaching me from all over the world, and they were asking me to share my flashcards, and they were asking me to tutor them, and they were asking me to do group lessons, and all of these things that I had never really anticipated. Financially, it was a huge windfall where I was able to pay off virtually all of my medical school loans by my first or second year of of residency. But more than that, I think the fact that my experiences struck a chord with other people, I think helped me realize I could help more people from outside of the system than potentially inside of it. By the end of residency, I had to make a decision about what direction I wanted to go. I had a lot of heart-to-hearts with people in medicine that I respect, as well as outside of medicine. And I think two themes really stood out. The first was what my advisor at Stanford told me many, many times over, which was, if you chase one rabbit, you can catch it. But if you chase two rabbits, you'll catch neither. And I think one of the challenges of both being a resident as well as trying to develop a system where people could learn things extremely well and make sure that they never forgot it and learn how to apply it, not just for their exams, but also their clinical practice. I think I realized while doing those two things at the same time that it wasn't going to be sustainable. For the short period of time of residency, I do believe that I was able to perform at a high level in multiple different capacities. But moving forward, I realized that trying to chase two rabbits long-term wasn't going to be sustainable. I think the other theme that stood out was what a friend had told me once, which was that when you change your plan, it oftentimes is a good sign. And the reason why is that as long as you change your plan for the right reasons, what it means is that there was something better for you that caused you to change your plan. And I think that that was true in this situation. I had always anticipated that I would just be a part of the system and that I would be probably an academic anesthesiologist somewhere, and that my teaching would probably just have to be something that I did almost on a volunteer basis. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I think that there are some excellent clinicians that I've met who are excellent educators, and we need more and more people like that. I think that in my case, I knew that what I had done was different in the way that I had approached my learning. I had always approached learning almost like a physics problem, where instead of trying to memorize everything as a detail, I tried to see all of medicine as a series of fundamental principles that I could apply again and again and again. In addition to that, I'd made a commitment very, very early on that I wanted to make sure that everything that I learned, I could remember for virtually forever. And because of that, for over 15 years, I have done basically Anki cards every single day to make sure that everything that I've learned, I can remember, because I wanted to carry that knowledge forward to be able to learn how to teach it to other people. Finally, the primary reason for this was not money that I did this. However, the fact that people will pay me and my company money in order to help them on their exams and to be able to transform their approach so they can learn more effectively and remember it and to be able to apply it, it aligns my incentives with their outcomes in a way that I don't think would have been true had I stayed in medicine. For the most part, if someone teaches really, really well, in many ways it hurts them professionally and financially, because for most of them, it's taking away time from their clinical practice and research, which is what drives the majority of their professional and personal outcomes. With that said, I also realize just how huge of a problem it is that we're trying to solve. I also know that there's no way that I can do this alone. And for that, I'm forever grateful for all the people that have been in our community as well as outside of it who are trying to make the system better for education for everyone. So that's it. This is why I chose to leave medicine after graduating from Stanford for medical school, as well as Harvard MGH for residency. If you found this helpful, be sure to check out UWorld Complete Guide, the 5 levels of mastery next. I'll show you exactly how to master UWorld to achieve the same kind of scores that helped me match at Harvard MGH.